So when you're preaching a difficult prophet, there's lots of things you can do. One thing that I would suggest, well, I'll mention three, but first of all, I'd say don't always go direct. So just because the prophet was shouting at someone about God's judgment doesn't mean that you have to shout at your people about God's judgment. You know, it could be that for them, the message is a real encouragement because God judges evil, and it doesn't mean they're evil necessarily. And so just because the prophet's direct doesn't mean that your sermon has to be direct. You need to think about how this will communicate and help your listeners. Then you can get creative. That's a second tip. The prophets were very creative. I don't think we need to go to extremes and, lie on our side for months on end and bury a belt in a river in a distant country. We don't need to go that far, but we can get creative. They were expert attention getters. And so as we're preaching a prophet, maybe we can reflect a little bit of that in terms of how we communicate. How does this sermon stand out from normal sermons? And it may be a use of a prop or something a little bit different, a bit more creative, maybe preaching in character. There's all sorts of possibilities. So you have to kind of weigh it up and say, okay, what's appropriate, what's going to work, what's not going to be distracting, but be creative with the communication. And then I suppose the third thing to keep in mind with prophets, just in terms of the tips, is as much as you're in this complex world of the prophet's situation, it seems so distant, so far removed from where we are today, but some things are just very consistent. The Bible is revealing God's heart and character. People still need that. It was communicated to sinners and sufferers in difficult circumstances in a fallen world. That's who we're preaching to as well. And actually, even the issue of judgment, which we tend to pull back from, even that's a gift. We wouldn't want to be in a world where there's no ultimate judgment. We want God to judge. We don't want God to judge us, of course, but that's a whole completely different aspect that we need to take on board in terms of the gospel. But we do not want a world where evil is just left to play out with no promise of judgment at the end of it. So some of those theological truths can really help our sermon on a difficult prophetic passage land in the hearts of our listeners today.